Have you ever noticed how just hearing the word risk, it kind of like instantly brings to mind things going wrong?
Yeah,
Almost like our brains are wired to zero in on what we should be steering clear of.
it's interesting, isn't it?
But what if, and this is for you, our listener, what if there's a way to flip that whole script on its head?
That's exactly what we're going to be diving into today. You know, in the world of risk management, there is this really essential kind of two-sided perspective that we really need to grasp, and today's deep dive is going to explore exactly that. We'll be taking a close look at Pritesh Biswas's article, Downside and Upside of Risk.
And the title itself kind of gives it away, doesn't
Yeah.
it? We're
Yeah.
not just going to be fixated on those potential negative impacts, the things that risk might throw our way or, throw at your organization.
Right.
Our mission, and this is for you listening in today, our mission is to shine a light on that often overlooked flip side. Those really tangible positive opportunities that are, believe it or not, interwoven with the whole idea of risk taking. So we're going to unpack how you can not only protect yourself, your business from setbacks, but maybe even more importantly, how to actually use those risks strategically
Yeah.
to fuel growth, to get ahead of the game, to gain that competitive edge that we all talk about.
Yeah.
And Pritesh Biswas lays out a really insightful framework for us to follow in this exploration.
Yeah, and I think most people listening probably already have a good handle on what downside risk is. Those are the things that could potentially negatively impact, your finances or cause damage to your reputation or even just disrupt the way you work.
The disruptions.
Yeah, and that's traditionally where most of the energy and risk management has gone. And it's understandable. You want to protect what you've built.
It makes sense, yeah. Downside risk, it's all about those adverse effects, the things that can cause harm. Think about it like this. You are a retailer, and all of a sudden, consumer demand changes. That's a downside risk right there. You could be stuck with a ton of inventory you can't sell, and that obviously eats into your profits. But, like Pritesh Biswas points out, there's another side to this coin, the upside risk.
And this is where it gets really exciting. Upside risk, it's all about the good stuff, the positive outcomes that can come out of venturing into the unknown. We're talking about opportunities for your business or even for you personally to grow, to maybe see bigger profits, to innovate, to really make a splash in your field.
Yeah.
And all of this can come from, believe it or not, taking those well-calculated risks.
Okay, so let's dig a bit deeper here. The article dives into some specific strategies for really maximizing that upside potential while still keeping a watchful eye on the downside, you know. And the first one that jumps out is identifying and analyzing the risks. Seems pretty fundamental.
And Biswas really stresses the importance of looking at all these potential risks with what he calls a dual lens. I think this is a really helpful way for you, the listener, to think about this. It's not enough just to see what could go wrong in any given situation.
Right.
You've got to proactively think about what might go right. What are the positive outcomes that could emerge?
Right.
By understanding both sides, the downside, the potential harm, and the upside, the potential gains, you're in a much stronger position to decide what risks are worth taking.
Yeah.
Which ones you should maybe avoid altogether.
It resonates, doesn't it? It's like having that balanced perspective. You got to be aware of what's at stake, but also what you could potentially gain, right? So next up, and this is crucial, is understanding your risk appetite and your risk tolerance.
Yeah, and this is important whether you're a business leader or, just navigating your own personal decisions.
Sure.
Risk appetite, it's essentially how comfortable you are with taking risks. How much uncertainty are you willing to embrace to try and reach your goals? And then risk tolerance, that's about how much risk you can handle, without jeopardizing everything.
Acceptable level.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Finding that sweet spot, that balance between the two is super important, both for grabbing those exciting opportunities and for not taking such a big hit that it wipes you out.
So it's about knowing how much you're willing to put on the line and what level of potential loss you can handle. Right?
Exactly.
Okay, so you've identified your risks, you understand your appetite for them. What's next? How do you keep an eye on all of this?
And that brings us to monitoring, right? How do you effectively track what's going on with those risks you've identified?
Yeah.
Biswas, he emphasizes enhanced risk monitoring. And it's not just about spotting potential problems.
Right. So you're not just waiting for something bad to happen.
No.
You're actively looking for those signals.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So for those downside risks, we've got those key risk indicators, the KRIs, that give you early warning signs that trouble might be brewing. But just as important, if not more so, are the KPIs, those key performance indicators that track the progress and the potential of your upside risks.
Okay.
So you're monitoring both.
So it's a two-pronged approach, isn't it?
Exactly.
Okay.
It gives you a complete picture.
Yeah. So you're keeping an eye out for storms, but also for those favorable winds, right?
That's a great way to put it.
The ones that can push you forward. All right. So we've identified the risk. We're monitoring them. What actions should you consider taking? How do you respond?
Well, the article talks about what it calls adaptive risk response strategies.
Okay.
And there are different approaches depending on whether you're dealing with a downside risk or you're looking at an upside opportunity.
Right.
For downside risks, you have those traditional responses, like avoidance. Just decide not to engage with that risk altogether.
Yeah.
Or mitigation.
That's a big one.
Take steps to reduce the impact or the likelihood of it happening. And then there's transferring the risk, things like insurance.
Yeah. Those are like, your classic defensive moves that individuals and organizations often take, right?
Absolutely.
But what about when you're actually looking at that upside risk? How do you respond to that?
That's where it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
Because maximizing the upside is about actively going after those opportunities.
So you're not shying away.
No.
You're stepping into it.
You're embracing it. You might invest in those innovative projects you've been thinking about. You might form those strategic partnerships that could really open doors for you. Or, just make some smart changes to the way you do things, your processes, to get that edge over your competition.
So it's like you said, it's much more proactive, almost like an offensive approach rather than a defensive one.
Exactly. You're not just trying to prevent bad things, you're actively trying to make good things happen.
That's really interesting. Now, all of this sounds great in theory, but how do you actually create this kind of mindset in an organization or even in your own personal decision-making?
You have to build what we call a risk-aware culture.
Okay.
Bizwas talks about this, You got to cultivate a mindset where risk isn't just seen as this negative force to be avoided. It's seen as a potential avenue for growth, for innovation, for making things better.
So it's about shifting the perspective on risk itself.
Exactly. And that means empowering people at every level to think creatively, to find ways to manage those downsides, and at the same time, leverage those risks to unlock new possibilities.
So more of an entrepreneurial spirit almost, yeah.
Yeah, you could say that. A more forward-thinking approach.
I like it. And the article also talks about scenario analysis, doesn't it?
It does. It's really valuable.
What is that?
Scenario planning. It's all about understanding what could happen, the good and the bad, under different circumstances.
Okay.
So you're thinking through various possibilities. What happens if the market takes a downturn?
Right.
What happens if a key supplier goes out of business?
Right.
But also, what happens if we land the huge contract or a new technology emerges that we can exploit?
Right. So you're playing out those different what ifs.
Yeah, exactly. It's like mental wargaming, so you're not caught off guard no matter what the future throws at you.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
So by actively managing those downsides and staying open to those upside potentials,
Yeah.
you're essentially preparing yourself to be more adaptable, more resilient, and ultimately setting yourself up for better growth in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary.
Now, the article also goes into some more specific elements of risk, starting with risk likelihood.
Yeah.
So what is that exactly?
Risk likelihood is simply how often a particular risk is expected to happen. You might also hear it called risk frequency. Biswas points out, though, that likelihood is a bit more of a broader term because frequency can sometimes suggest that something happens regularly when, that's not always the case. So it might not always be something that occurs on a predictable schedule.
Right. It's not always like clockwork.
Yeah. And likelihood, it can be assessed in a couple of ways. You have inherent risk, which is how likely an event is to happen naturally without any controls in place.
Okay.
And then you have likelihood based on the current conditions, with those controls you actually have in place.
Right.
I think a good example would be, let's say, a transport company, right?
Mm-hmm.
They could look at their data and see how often their vehicles break down. That's based on their current situation, which includes, their maintenance program.
Right.
Now, to try and figure out the inherent likelihood, like how often would those vehicles break down if they had no maintenance program at all?
It's hypothetical, yeah.
It's hypothetical. It's a bit more tricky.
It's a thought experiment.
Yeah, but it helps you understand the value of those preventative measures.
There's controls you have in place.
Exactly.
Okay, so it highlights the effectiveness of those actions that you're taking. And whether it's inherent risk or likelihood with your current controls, comparing your performance to the industry average can be really insightful.
Yeah.
Are you having more or fewer problems than others in your field? It gives you a benchmark, right?
It does. It gives you some context. Are you doing better than average, or do you need to step up your game?
Yeah, that comparative perspective, I think, is really helpful for people. Now, the article also mentions that some controls you might have, they don't necessarily stop a risk from happening, but they can make its impact less severe, right?
Yeah.
So it's not about prevention, it's about minimizing the damage.
It's about reducing the impact. Like if you're wearing a helmet when you're cycling, it doesn't prevent you from having an accident, but it can significantly reduce the severity of a head injury if you do fall.
Right.
Another example might be a sports team, right?
Okay.
They could have really strict training regimens and nutrition guidelines for their players, all aimed at reducing the likelihood of injuries.
So the training there targets the likelihood.
Right.
But then having a great medical team and good insurance, that would be more about managing the impact if a player does get injured.
Exactly.
They're tackling it from a different angle.
Yeah.
So they're managing the consequences.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's about managing the overall magnitude.
Which brings us to risk magnitude.
Yes.
So how does this tie together with likelihood and impact? What is it all about?
So risk and magnitude, it's basically the overall size or scale of a risk. And it consists both the likelihood, how often it might happen, and the impact, how bad it'll be if it does happen.
Okay.
So it's a more comprehensive view.
So a risk that's really likely to happen, but the impact is relatively minor, could have a similar magnitude to a risk that's unlikely. But if it did happen, it would be catastrophic.
Exactly. That high likelihood but low impact could be on par with the low likelihood but high impact.
Right.
And Biswas makes this point that risk magnitude is different from just looking at risk impact alone.
So impact is just one side of the equation.
It is. Impact only focuses on how bad the consequences would be without considering how likely they are to happen.
Okay.
And when you think about risk magnitude, it helps you prioritize your risk management efforts because it takes both of those factors into account.
It makes sense. You got to focus your attention and resources where the overall risk is the greatest. Right.
Exactly.
Now, the article then shifts focus to hazard risks.
Yeah, and this is interesting. When we're talking about hazard risks, things like fires, accidents, fraud, the magnitude of the risk is often directly related to how severe it is.
Okay.
So the article emphasizes how important it is to try and reduce the severity of these hazard risks.
And how do you do that? How do you reduce the severity?
It's about focusing on two things: lowering the potential immediate impact, the direct damage, and also the long-term consequences that you might face.
Right.
We talked about the seatbelt example.
Right.
It reduces the injury severity, the impact, but not the likelihood of the accident.
Right.
It's about minimizing the potential harm. Take, for example, a data breach, right?
A big one these days?
Huge these days, yeah.
Yeah.
The immediate impact could be system downtime, financial losses from trying to recover your data. And then to try and lessen that severity, you need to focus on mitigating the impact on what we call your firm.
Okay.
That's finances, infrastructure, reputation, and market position.
Okay. That makes sense.
And that means doing things to limit the damage during the breach, and then containing the cost of recovery, compensating your customers.
So it's like damage control, essentially.
Yeah, you could call it that.
Okay.
And then there are those longer-term consequences.
What about those? What do we do about those?
Those can really affect your STOC, which stands for strategy, tactics, operations, and compliance.
Wow, it's a lot of areas.
Yeah, it can be really far-reaching. So the article introduces this idea of loss control, which is all about trying to lower the scale, the impact, and the overall outcomes of that negative event. And then there's damage control, which is about protecting your reputation after something bad has happened.
It's all about managing the fallout.
Yeah. It's not just about the immediate damage. Let's say you have a major service outage for your online business.
Oh, yeah?
You need to reassure your customers, your stakeholders, that you're on top of it, right?
Right.
You need to communicate clearly, quickly, and leadership needs to be visible.
Right.
Because if you don't, that reputational damage can really spiral out of control.
So being prepared to communicate is key.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole issue of controlling the cost after an incident. That's where those well-defined plans, your business continuity plan, BCT, and your disaster recovery plan, your DRP, come into play. They help keep those post-incident costs as low as possible, and they get you back up and running faster.
So reducing the severity of hazard risks, it's not just about stopping them from happening, it's also about having those plans in place to limit the damage and control the costs.
Absolutely.
And the article talks about how this applies to so many different areas.
It does. It's relevant to fraud prevention, health and safety in the workplace, protecting your property, keeping your IT systems reliable, managing your reputation. In all of these, effective risk management is about more than just trying to prevent things from happening. It's about having those plans in place to limit the damage, to contain the cost if something does go wrong. And the insurance industry, as Biswas points out, they're really focused on making sure those claims are settled efficiently and cost effectively. It's what they call cost containment, right?
Okay.
They want to get people back on their feet as quickly as possible.
Yeah, so it's like a multifaceted approach. You're trying to prevent things from happening, but you're also prepared to deal with the fallout if they do.
Absolutely.
So it's all coming back to this loss control,
Mhm.
which includes prevention, damage limitation, and cost containment.
Exactly.
3 sides of the same coin. And the article goes into detail about each one of these, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah. So let's unpack these a bit more, starting with loss prevention.
Loss prevention is really about reducing the likelihood of something bad happening in the first place. It's about taking steps to stop that event from occurring altogether. And of course, the methods you use are going to vary depending on the type of risk you're facing.
Can you give us some specific examples for our listeners?
Sure. So for your personal health and safety, it might be about adopting a healthier lifestyle, exercising regularly, eating right, avoiding risky activities.
Right.
For your home, it could be installing smoke detectors, storing flammable materials safely.
Sure.
For a business, it might mean separating those financial duties, conducting background checks on employees
To prevent fraud.
to prevent fraud. Yeah.
Yeah.
An industrial facility might use regular equipment inspections, safety training to prevent accidents.
So it's all about those proactive measures
Exactly.
to reduce the chance of something happening.
Yeah. You're trying to minimize the likelihood of that risk materializing.
Got it. Okay, so what about damage limitation? Where does that fit in?
Damage limitation is all about what you do when that adverse event is actually happening.
It's that in the moment response.
Exactly. It's about reducing the severity of that event as it's unfolding, trying to minimize the damage it causes.
Okay.
So you need to have those plans in place, those responses that you can activate quickly.
Right, so you're ready to go.
Yeah, you need to be prepared to act fast.
So what would be some examples of damage limitation?
So think about fire extinguishers in your home or your workplace. They don't prevent the fire, but they can help contain it.
Right.
If you're a business facing a cyber attack, you might have intrusion detection systems, protocols for isolating infected systems.
Right.
Other examples could be fireproof safes, surge protectors, even backup generators, anything that helps you maintain those essential services during an outage.
First aid kits. Right, that's damage limitation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in more specialized settings like a chemical plant, it might involve having containment systems to prevent the spread of hazardous materials if there's a leak.
So you're not just preventing, you're containing.
Exactly.
Okay. So what about cost containment? That's the last piece, right?
Yes. Cost containment is all about minimizing the financial impact, the long-term financial consequences after something has happened. It's about keeping those repair costs down, recovering quickly, using your resources effectively to manage that financial burden.
So how does that work practically? What can individuals or businesses do?
Well, you could activate your disaster recovery plan, use your insurance policies to cover losses, implement your business continuity plan to make sure those essential operations are back up and running as soon as possible.
Okay.
Let's say there's a fire at your business.
Right.
Cost containment would be things like salvaging what you can, cleaning up quickly, getting good deals with contractors to do those repairs. And ideally, all of this should be outlined in your BCP, your DRP, your crisis management plan.
You need to have a roadmap.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And your insurance might even cover things like the increased cost of operation, if you need to move temporarily or outsource some of your work.
And the article uses the example of a product recall, which I think is a good illustration of all this.
Yeah.
Like in a real-world business context.
It is a great example because a recall, it can be really costly for a business.
Yeah.
There are the direct costs, like managing the whole recall process, putting out those ads to inform customers, but then there are the indirect costs, the lost production time, potentially losing market share because of bad publicity, and that can really hurt you in the long run.
Right.
So a well-managed recall, it's got to address all 3 areas: protecting customers, removing the faulty product, complying with regulations, and of course, safeguarding the company's finances and reputation.
So it's really a balancing act, isn't it?
Yeah.
All those elements working together. Okay, so we've covered loss prevention, damage limitation, and cost containment.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all about managing that downside risk, right?
Right.
But now let's flip the script and look at the upside.
Yeah.
The article talks about how defining this positive side of risk, it could be tricky sometimes.
It can. I mean, risk management has traditionally been all about preventing negative outcomes, right?
Right.
But as Biswas highlights, it's also about helping you achieve your goals.
Your objectives, yeah.
Yeah, and those could be things like meeting those regulatory requirements, improving your decision making, making your operations more efficient.
Sure.
And the upside of risk really comes in when managing risk effectively leads to those unexpected beneficial outcomes.
You're getting more than just avoiding losses.
Exactly. So you're not just playing defense, you're actively looking for opportunities to gain something.
You're going on the offensive.
Yeah.
I like it.
The article actually defines the upside of risk as the gains that you achieve which are greater than what you would have achieved if you had just avoided the risk altogether.
Okay.
So think about it like this. You're a small business. You decide to invest in a new, untested technology. It's risky, it might not work out.
Sure.
But the potential upside is it could make you way more efficient and you could get a huge head start on your competition.
Right.
And that's a gain that you wouldn't have gotten if you had just stuck with your old ways.
It reminds me of that saying, sometimes the greatest risk is not taking one.
Yeah, exactly.
Or that whole mountain climbing analogy. right?
Yeah, I like that one.
You know, the climb is risky, but the view from the top,
Yeah.
that's the reward.
The upside. And another way to think about it is that effective risk management is really about trying to get the best possible results while reducing the uncertainty in what you're doing.
Okay.
So from that perspective, the upside of risk is simply achieving your goals by managing the risks involved in your strategies and your operations.
So it's not about being reckless.
No, not at all.
It's about calculated risk taking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Biswas talks about this idea of specifically looking for what he calls positive risks, like during those risk assessment workshops. And the key question there is, what events could lead to even better outcomes than we're expecting?
Right.
So you're actually looking for those potential positive scenarios, and then you can take steps to make them more likely to happen or to make those benefits even bigger.
You're actively encouraging positive risks.
Yeah. It's about shifting your mindset, not just mitigating the negative, but actually trying to cultivate the positive.
That's a really interesting concept.
And one of the big benefits for you, the listener, is that by focusing on the upside, you can go after opportunities that others might be too afraid to touch.
Because they're too focused on the risk.
Exactly. You might find a more efficient way to do a project or a cost-effective solution that nobody else has thought of.
Right.
And that willingness to take a chance can give you a real advantage in your field.
So it's about having the courage to go after those opportunities.
Yeah, and having the framework to manage that risk effectively.
Right.
And even just having a good risk management process in place can be an upside in itself.
How so?
Because it gives you the confidence to pursue those riskier but potentially more rewarding opportunities that others might avoid.
Right.
You know, they're too busy playing it safe.
So it's like having a safety net, it allows you to take those bigger leaps.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, the article also mentions that there's a bit of a debate within risk management about how exactly to define this upside.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah.
Some experts have suggested adding another T to the traditional 4 Ts,
Okay.
which are tolerate, treat, transfer, terminate.
Right.
And this 5th T would be take the risk.
I like that.
It's specifically about embracing risk for the opportunity it presents.
Okay.
But the main point is that it's not about being reckless. It's about seeing the opportunity, even if it comes with some uncertainty.
So it's about actively looking for and pursuing opportunities, not just trying to avoid those threats.
Exactly.
And then the article talks about opportunity assessment, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And this is a really important part of capitalizing on those business opportunities.
Sure.
Organizations need to be able to conduct thorough opportunity assessments. And a lot of consulting firms actually specialize in this, you know? They look at the potential profits, the extra income you could generate, the boost to your reputation.
So it's kind of like a risk assessment, but instead of focusing on what could go wrong, you're looking at what could go right.
Yeah, in a way. But a good opportunity assessment will also look at any potential downsides.
Okay.
Sometimes, after doing a thorough assessment, a company might decide not to pursue an opportunity because the risks are just too high.
The article uses that example of the struggling theater, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
That theater might do an assessment to see how they can make more money from their existing audience, maybe by offering better food and drinks, selling merchandise related to the shows. They could also look at sponsorship deals with local businesses,
Okay.
trying to figure out what kind of shows would attract sponsors.
So they can take on those riskier productions.
Exactly.
But they have that support. It sounds like a lot of organizations and even individuals, they already do this opportunity management, even if they don't call it that.
Yeah, I think that's true. But ideally, it should be a formal part of the strategic planning process.
Right.
But some organizations, they still don't have a set process for assessing new ventures, mergers, acquisitions.
But it seems like things are moving towards a more integrated approach where you're looking at both the risks and the opportunities.
Yeah, definitely. More and more organizations are including both in their risk assessment workshops, and they're even adapting their risk matrices, those likelihood and impact scores, to reflect both the potential gains and losses.
So it's not just about the negative anymore.
No.
It's a more balanced view.
And this often means bringing in a diverse team to do the assessment.
Right.
You need people who understand operations and compliance for those traditional risks, but you also need people who are focused on strategy and market analysis to identify those opportunities.
So it's a team effort.
It is.
And once you've identified and analyzed an opportunity, what's next? What do you do then?
The next step is evaluation, really digging deep into those potential benefits and figuring out what actions you need to take to increase the chances of actually getting those benefits.
Okay.
And the article makes the point that you can use that same opportunity assessment approach to manage those identified opportunities on your risk matrix, just like you would manage those traditional negative risks.
So it's a consistent framework.
Yeah.
You're applying it to both sides of the equation. Now, the article also provides some examples of risk assessment checklist.
It does.
Yeah.
And these are just examples of those hazard risks that organizations should consider during their assessment.
Okay.
So the article has checklists for financial risks, things like the availability of funding, how effective your financial controls are, infrastructure risks, which covers the management structure, IT systems, business continuity plans. There's a checklist for reputational risks, which looks at public perception, ethical standards, and then a checklist for marketplace risks, things like the level of competition, the stability of the economy, the complexity of your supply chain.
It's a good reminder of how many different areas you need to be thinking about.
It is, yeah, it's a wide spectrum.
And then the article talks about risk scoring.
Right. So the article presents the simple risk scoring scale. It goes from no risk, which has a score of 0, all the way up to extreme risk, which has a score of 5.
Okay.
And the idea is that you can use this scoring system to calculate what's called a riskiness index for the organization.
Okay.
And this index, it gives you a clear picture of the organization's overall risk exposure.
And what's the benefit of having this index? What can an organization do with it?
It allows the board, the senior management, to see whether the actual level of risk that the organization is facing matches up with their risk appetite.
Their willingness to take risks.
Exactly. And their risk capacity, which is the maximum level of risk they could handle without putting the whole organization